Imagine a freezing 1960s Canadian winter evening, long before delivery apps existed, when the only way to get a hot meal was to rely on your own pantry. Today, we are exploring 9 vintage winter survival foods our grandparents absolutely depended on. Please give this video a like and kindly subscribe. Number 1. Split pea and ham soup. Let's start with a dish that is basically a legally required winter staple across the entire country. A massive, steaming pot of split pea and ham soup. Before massive grocery stores carried fresh winter produce, French-Canadian families relied heavily on dried yellow split peas because they literally lasted forever in a freezing cellar. To make this thick, foggy green soup, cooks would take a leftover ham bone, complete with all the fatty, salty scraps of meat still clinging to it, and furiously boil it down for hours to create an incredibly rich, smoky broth. Once the dried peas were added, they slowly dissolved into a completely thick, porridge-like consistency that would instantly stick to your ribs. I actually spent 3 hours researching vintage pantry staples from this era, and what shocked me was how entirely dependent rural communities were on heavily smoked meats just to survive the freezing months. Served with a brutally thick slice of buttered white bread, this intensely savory, ridiculously cheap soup was the absolute ultimate defense against a bitter February blizzard. It remains a deeply comforting, highly nostalgic bowl of pure Canadian winter survival history, perfectly captured in a single pot. Number 2. Classic glazed meatloaf. If there was one single dish that completely dominated the 1960s suburban dinner table, it was the unapologetically massive ketchup-glazed meatloaf. While we previously discussed Salisbury steak, the traditional meatloaf was an entirely different beast designed specifically to feed a massive family for multiple days. Frugal mothers would take cheap ground beef and aggressively stretch it to its absolute limits by mixing in heavy handfuls of crushed saltine crackers, rolled oats, and finely chopped onions. It was forcefully packed into a standard bread loaf pan and completely smothered in a thick, violently red layer of sweet tomato ketchup before hitting the hot oven. As it baked, the ketchup caramelized into an incredibly sticky, sweet, slightly charred crust that beautifully contrasted the dense, savory meat inside. The absolute best part of this massive dinner was arguably the leftovers. Slicing a cold, dense piece of leftover meatloaf the next morning and frying it aggressively in a hot skillet for a massive winter sandwich was basically a rite of passage for every Canadian kid. It is heavily processed, intensely cheap, and deeply, unapologetically comforting when the snow is completely piling up outside your kitchen window. Number 3. Macaroni and Tomato Juice. Have you ever been completely snowed in with absolutely nothing fresh left in the entire house? Enter the incredibly resourceful, deeply frugal masterpiece known simply as macaroni and tomato juice. This was a massive holdover from the Great Depression that remained wildly popular throughout the 1960s purely because of its sheer convenience. It literally requires only 2 completely indestructible pantry items: a box of dry macaroni noodles and a giant tin of heavily salted bright red tomato juice. You simply boil the pasta until it is incredibly soft, drain it, and then completely drown it in the cold, acidic tomato juice directly in the pot. It was usually aggressively seasoned with nothing more than basic table salt, heavy black pepper, and maybe a tiny dab of yellow butter if you were feeling particularly wealthy. While it sounds incredibly basic to our modern palates, the starchy pasta perfectly absorbed the sharp, acidic bite of the juice. It was an incredibly fast, fiercely cheap, completely foolproof hot lunch that mothers could instantly throw together in 10 minutes when the kids came stomping inside, completely freezing and heavily covered in thick winter snow. Number 4. Fevolar baked beans. We absolutely must discuss the incredibly heavy, intensely sweet, deeply traditional French-Canadian winter staple known as Fevolar, or slow-baked pork and beans. Long before convenient canned versions completely took over the supermarket shelves, making proper baked beans was an intense weekend-long ritual. Families would take hard, dried navy beans and soak them completely overnight before layering them into a heavy ceramic bean pot with massive chunks of raw, fatty salt pork, dry mustard, and a completely outrageous amount of dark, pure maple syrup. The heavy pot was tightly sealed and shoved into a low oven to slowly bake for 8 to 10 agonizing hours. By the time it finally emerged, the beans were incredibly soft, perfectly tender, and completely bathed in an incredibly thick, dark, sticky, violently sweet and salty molasses-like syrup. The rendered pork fat completely melted into the maple sugar, creating a wildly rich, ridiculously heavy side dish. Served heavily for Saturday night dinner and then reheated perfectly for a massive Sunday morning breakfast, these incredibly dense beans provided the absolute maximum amount of vital winter calories needed to furiously shovel out a completely snowed-in rural driveway. Number 5. Welsh Rare Bit. When a blinding snowstorm knocked out the power, and you needed a hot meal cooked strictly on a small gas stove, Welsh Rare Bit was the absolute reigning champion. Despite the incredibly deceptive, highly aristocratic-sounding name, there is absolutely zero rabbit meat involved in this quick vintage dish. It is essentially the absolute ultimate, highly elevated version of basic cheese on toast. A frugal homemaker would aggressively whisk sharp cheddar cheese, a heavy splash of warm milk or dark stout beer, dry mustard powder, and a generous dash of spicy Worcestershire sauce into a thick, bubbling, incredibly savory cheese sauce. This violently hot, rich yellow lava was then aggressively poured directly over thick slices of roughly toasted white bread. It is fiercely savory, wonderfully tangy, and incredibly heavy. I personally think this is the most underrated quick dinner of the entire decade. It literally takes 5 minutes but feels like a massive, sophisticated pub meal. The sharp bite of the mustard beautifully cuts through the intensely rich, fatty cheese, making it the absolute perfect, incredibly comforting hot supper to eat while aggressively shivering in a freezing, dimly lit 1960s Canadian kitchen. Number 6. Beef stew with Doughboys. There is nothing quite like the incredibly heavy, fragrant scent of a massive pot of dark beef stew completely taking over a freezing winter house. But in the 1960s, a standard meat stew simply wasn't filling enough for a starving, freezing family. The absolute mandatory addition was the inclusion of massive, heavy flour dumplings, affectionately known across the country as Doughboys. Frugal mothers would take the absolute toughest, cheapest cuts of beef and simmer them furiously for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until the meat finally surrendered and became tender. Then, in the final 20 minutes, they would drop massive, sticky spoonfuls of thick biscuit dough directly onto the bubbling, dark brown gravy and forcefully clamp the heavy lid shut. The intense steam aggressively cooked the dough, transforming it into giant, fluffy, incredibly dense dumplings that perfectly absorbed the rich, salty beef broth. Tearing into a steaming, hot, gravy-soaked doughboy was an incredibly profound, deeply satisfying culinary experience. It was the absolute ultimate, unpretentious, incredibly heavy winter meal designed entirely to completely warm you up from the absolute inside out on the coldest nights. Number 7. Perfection Salad. We are stepping right back into the highly terrifying, beautifully wobbly world of vintage gelatin to discuss a bizarre winter side dish known as Perfection Salad. During the deep winter, fresh, crunchy greens were incredibly expensive and incredibly rare. To simulate the absolute crunch of a fresh summer salad, 1960s housewives relied heavily on a brightly colored, intensely jiggly ring of savory jello. They would aggressively shred completely indestructible winter storage vegetables like hard green cabbage, tough carrots, and sharp raw onions, and completely encase them in a massive, quivering mold of lemon-flavored gelatin heavily spiked with acidic white vinegar. It was always served completely ice-cold, sitting sadly on a plate, and usually accompanied by a completely unnecessary, thick dollop of heavy mayonnaise. The bizarre contrast between the intensely sweet lemon jelly, the sharp, acidic vinegar, and the aggressive, loud crunch of the raw cabbage completely baffles the modern mind. However, it completely dominated winter dinner parties because it visually looked incredibly bright, terribly festive, and allowed families to actually consume raw vegetables when massive snowdrifts completely buried the garden outside. It is truly a baffling culinary relic today. Number 8. Canned peaches and cottage cheese. If you want to talk about the absolute pinnacle of 1960s diet culture intersecting with bleak winter pantry staples, look no further than canned peaches and cottage cheese. When the post-holiday winter gloom set in and mothers wanted a quick, supposedly light lunch, this completely bizarre combination was the absolute undisputed champion. You essentially took a massive wet scoop of cold, lumpy, slightly salty cottage cheese and plopped it directly into the center of a small glass bowl. Then, you aggressively surrounded it with two glowing, unnaturally bright orange, perfectly uniform canned peach halves, dripping with thick, heavy, intensely sweet industrial syrup. I have been entirely obsessed with this weird culinary phenomenon since I was a kid, constantly wondering who actually decided these two violently contrasting textures belonged together in a single bowl. The extreme saltiness of the curds violently clashes with the aggressive, artificial sweetness of the heavy syrup in a way that is incredibly jarring but somehow wildly nostalgic. It required absolutely zero cooking, utilized completely shelf-stable winter ingredients, and perfectly represented the highly confusing, delightfully weird, texturally chaotic reality of a standard 1960s midwinter lunch. Number 9. Old-fashioned rice pudding. We conclude our freezing midwinter survival menu with the absolute greatest, incredibly cheap, profoundly comforting dessert of the entire era: old-fashioned rice pudding. Unlike the cold, heavily processed plastic cups you buy at the modern supermarket today, a proper 1960s winter rice pudding was served aggressively hot directly from the oven. Homemakers would take a massive scoop of leftover boiled white rice, completely drown it in a heavy mixture of whole milk, fresh eggs, sugar, and a massive amount of warm cinnamon, and bake it incredibly slowly. The absolute mandatory addition was a massive handful of dried raisins that would aggressively plump up, absorbing all the sweet, milky vanilla custard as the dish baked. The intense heat of the oven would create a beautifully thick, dark brown, caramelized skin right on the absolute top of the pudding, which was heavily fought over by the entire family. It was an incredibly heavy, violently sweet, deeply warm dessert that completely stuck to your ribs, providing the perfect, intensely comforting, highly aromatic finish to a freezing, pitch-black Canadian winter evening long before delivery existed anywhere. It was pure magic. These 9 vintage winter meals prove that 1960s Canadian home cooks were absolute masters of turning basic pantry staples into incredibly comforting, hearty survival food. Which of these deeply nostalgic dishes would you actually want to eat during a massive winter blizzard? Let me know in the comments below, and please subscribe.